Thanks for joining me for this session. Today we're going to talk about everyday macro. My name is Ashley. I'm going to be your host today. I'm an imaging specialist with Sony. Let's get right into it. So the topics we're going to cover today are going to be defining macro, lenses 101, depth of field, shooting techniques, camera settings, and composition. So first out, what is macro? Well, the true definition of macro is basically photographing something extremely close so that the piece that we're photographing is life size on the imaging sensor. What that means is I might be photographing something like this, but the camera is going to see it like this. So the cool thing about this is it opens up this whole super small world that we really overlook. Now, not everything that's defined and exactly macro is macro, right? A lot of times we call this macro, or we may call something like this macro. Even stuff like this we might call macro, where yes, it's technically just close-up photography, but we're going to talk about it all in general as just close-up photography, not true macro. So before we start, a couple things you may want to have with you if you start pursuing macro photography. First one being a good tripod, something actually that has a center column that can pivot out or even remove and mount upside down. This just helps you get nice and low and close to the subject. I also find it really important to have either a small little LED light or a flash that I can run wirelessly from the camera. So a lot of times I take some of the Sony flashes and I can use those remotely, or I have a small pocket LED light. A modifier for light is also a very nice thing to have. Not just something that I can put on that flash or that LED light, but even some of the little pop-up reflectors and diffusers are super handy to have out in the field. I really prefer buying the pop-up diffusers that come with the reflector covers on them, because I can do two things. I can use the diffuser to knock down the light as I'm photographing maybe a flower or something like that. So it just really flattens the light on my subject. It's not so harsh. And then I can actually use the reflectors and I can set those on the ground beneath the subject. And a lot of times I can get bounced light off of that, which will just give a nice little kick of warmth into the subject as I'm photographing it. Another important piece to have with you is going to be a remote. If you're like me, you may also just forget the remote at home, in which case you can use a 2-second timer, or you can use the Imaging Edge mobile app as a remote as well. Make sure you have some gaffer's tape. It is really the photographer's duct tape and will fix any solution or fix any problem. The solution to any problem, I should say. I also really like to have either a misting bottle or a little eyedropper with me. The thing that you can do here is if I'm photographing flowers and stuff like that, I can use the eyedropper and I can drop little beads of water on petals, and it just creates a whole nother dynamic. Let's talk about some of the lenses available. So true macro capable lenses, Sony produces the 30mm macro, the 50mm macro, and the 90mm macro. The 30mm macro is designed for APS-C, whereas the 50 and 90 will work on full frame. Your biggest difference in these lenses is going to be the working distance that they provide. And we'll touch on that in just a second. The other option that you have are going to be a range of telephoto lenses that Sony produces, which actually work really well for close-up focus. So this could be the 70 to 350 if you're using APS-C, or a 70 to 300, or 100 to 400 if you're using a full frame. The thing I really like about the 100 to 400 is that I can be all the way at 400mm and I'm just over 3 feet from the subject. So it actually works out fantastic if I'm photographing things like frogs or lizards or butterflies. It's a perfect lens for it. As we talk about working distance, I'm going to show you basically the 90, the 50, and the 30, and how close I have to be to the subject to get the same picture on all three of them. So this won't be at true macro range on them, but Here I'm 14.5 inches away. With the 50 millimeter, I'm 9.6 inches away, or 9.5 inches. And with the 30 millimeter macro, I'm basically 6 inches away. So I have to get significantly closer as that millimeter gets wider, but the results are the same. They all produce the same image. It's just I have a greater working distance with a greater millimeter. So the 90 millimeter works perfectly if I'm trying to photograph, again, bugs, lizards, things of that nature, things that are going to run if I get too close to them. The 50 millimeter macro is honestly, and the 30 millimeter macro are both fantastic if I'm photographing flowers, if I'm photographing coins or other kind of currency, small products, things like that. They work fantastic for it. A lot of these lenses you can actually do double duty with too. I can have them as a portrait lens as well as a macro lens, and there's a limiter switch on the side, so I can lock it in either the full range, so macro all the way to or all the way to infinity, or I can lock it in just the macro range or just the infinity range, if you will. So infinity to about a half a meter or a third of a meter. All right. The number one struggle that I see with people doing macro photography, and for a while myself even doing macro photography, is really controlling depth of field. And the thing that we run into is when we start getting really, really close to the subject, my depth of field or my area of focus becomes razor thin. And so it's really easy to have not what I want in focus or miss focus on my subject. So this is just a little quick example showing how quickly they can fall out of focus here. So this is set on manual focus, shooting this bee on the flower. And we can see he is sharp, he's in focus, but as he takes flight and he moves maybe about an inch, maybe even an inch and a half, and he's already completely out of focus. And then after he gets beyond that, he's way out of focus. So it doesn't take long for my subject to move out of that focus range when we get there. So how do we maximize our potential with depth of field? If I'm photographing at 2.8 on, let's say, the 90 millimeter macro, that focus range or that depth of field is going to be razor thin, like I said. If I want to increase that, one way I can do it is through my aperture. So if I go to f8 or if I go to f16, I'm going to start increasing that depth of field and I'm going to have more of my subject in focus. So quick little example. This is at 2.8, a very narrow margin of error here, or very narrow range of focus, really. And as I start bumping this up to 5.6, to f8, to f11, to f16, 22, and even all the way up to f32, we can see a significant difference in how much depth of field we create. The problem that we're going to run into, though, is, as we all know, as soon as I stop down that aperture, my shutter speed is going to slow way down, right? Because we're reducing how much light can come in through that lens. The only way to really balance this out would be to boost my ISO. Luckily, the newest generation of Sony cameras do phenomenal at higher ISOs, so this isn't as much of an issue anymore. A few years ago, though, I mean, this would have been a deal breaker a lot of times. And so most people would go to using a tripod and they would just sacrifice and go with a slower shutter speed. The other thing that we can do is actually change our distance to the subject. So in the little example here, you can see they're all at f16, but that depth of field is going to be significantly larger if I move further away from my subject. So quick example here. So this is at f11 and I'm 2 feet away, and you can see everything in that flower is sharp. Everything from the middle of the flower all the way to the petals we can see is nice and in focus. When I get about 6 inches away, I know it's an entirely different shot, but really the focus is only on that small area. The petals in the background are completely gone. defocused and everything, and we're still at f11. So that compression that builds up as we get closer to our subject really makes that focus area get narrower and narrower. So with that said, a lot of times my favorite combination right now is actually pairing the A7R4 with the 90mm macro, because I find I can be back just a little bit more and use the added resolution in that camera really to crop and make up the difference. And the results look the same as if I was up close, only now I have a much greater depth of field without having to sacrifice shutter speed or boost ISO. As we start talking about composition, I'm just as guilty of this as anybody else, but I get hyper focused on my subject and I start neglecting the backgrounds and the borders of the frame. And so I'll take a photo like this, and once I get home, I'll realize, whoops, I have this other flower in the background that's kind of a distraction. Had I just shifted where I was shooting, problem would have been avoided. So we really want to aim for a nice clean background. That way the focus stays on our subject. Just another example with a nice clean background here. And then the problem comes when we get into wintertime. So myself, I live in Minnesota, meaning that for like 6 months of the year, you really don't want to be outside photographing. So that limits what we can do, right? Not so much. What I actually really like to do, and I would advise you do this as well, as you're photographing stuff that you normally take pictures of, might be a landscape, might be just random nature shots. Shoot your normal photo like you would, like this, but then also take one and shoot it completely out of focus. So put the camera all the way at its minimum focus or its closest focus, and it will really just completely blur out the image so that it looks more something like this. Now what we'll do is we'll go to our local camera store and we'll have them actually print this out onto, if you're going to do this at home, I would say print it out on something big like 11 by 14 or something of that nature, a bigger piece of paper, and then actually have them put it on foam core for you as well. If it's something that I'm going to maybe travel with these, print it out on like an 8 by 12, still on foam core, but then it's a little more travel friendly. But if you're doing it at home, doing it on a bigger piece of paper actually is a lot easier for you, and you give you a little bit more room to work with. But what this looks like in practice is something like this, where I'll have the camera on a timer. I'm just going to hold my light, hold my background behind my subject, but what I get is actually something like this. And the reason I say to actually produce these by defocusing and taking a picture of something in nature is that the colors are more true to what nature is, as opposed to just going into Photoshop and splashing green on a canvas and calling it good. So this actually gives you a more true, more natural representation of what the colors would be like in nature. The other big thing when we use these backgrounds is we want to make sure that my lighting matches similarly to the background. Meaning if I shoot a defocused shot of a sunset where it's an orange kind of cast, I want to make sure that I put a similar kind of filter on my light so that the light coming off of my flash or off my LED light gives that same warmth that the background is showing. A little bit about composition here. One of my favorite rules of composition, and honestly, I think the easiest way to practice with and the easiest one to pick up and run with is rule of thirds, where we want to put our subject on one of the thirds lines that run through the frame. And ideally, if we can put our point of interest right where those lines intersect. But it's a super simple way to kind of set it up and shoot. Another way to practice composition, or if maybe I don't have a good thirds to set up because I have a really busy background or things of that nature, is fill the frame. So I'm going to get up as close as I can to my subject, and I'm just going to have them take up as much of the frame as I can. final bit of advice that I will give to everybody in terms of composition is to work the subject. So just like everyone else, my creative juices aren't really flowing when I start the photo shoot. So a lot of times I will walk up to photograph maybe a flower at like the Arboretum or something like that. Uh, and so I walk up to it and I'll shoot something like this and I'll start walking away and I'll just say, nope, we can do better. So first thing is start photographing from different angles, because it really changes the dynamic of the photo when we're not looking at it from the view we see the world all the time. So get low, get dirty. Sometimes we have to get up close. And then changing your angle, adding light, diffusing light, do what you can. But try to get creative with it. Don't just take one shot and move on. I would say a lot of times I'm shooting probably a dozen at least. And in most cases, I'm probably shooting about 50 to 100 shots on a lot of these flowers and stuff like that that I photograph. And it's really just so that I make sure that I've worked over the subject as much as I can. I've taken every opportunity, every angle to really capture a good shot. So another example for you here. This would be the first one. I walk up and I shoot, and as I look at it, I go, it doesn't really do anything for me. The background is really too busy, so it distracts from the subject. So I go around, I shoot it from the other side. It's better because the background is now further from my subject. It defocuses quite a bit more. So it's not as distracting, but still just doesn't really do anything for me. It's not really jumping out. And so then I start working at getting closer, and I find the dynamic gets a lot greater with the image. When I have critters in the backyard, I go about it the same way. The first shot is usually just to capture them and make sure I got a photo of them. From there, I start looking at it and I go, well, the background's really distracting. I have that tree in the background. You as the viewer might not see it, but me as the photographer, I see it right away as the fence in the background as well jumps out at me. So I need to find a cleaner background. So again, I start rotating around, shooting it from different angles. Unfortunately, this one I got rid of my tree, but now I have my neighbor's shed in the background. So we rotate yet again, and now I have a nice clean background. And so as long as my subject is going to stay there and keep modeling for me, I'll keep shooting. And eventually you get some really nice stuff out of it. And so we'll kind of end on going over some of the different camera settings I would advise, as well as some different shooting technique as we get into shooting macro. So Sony provides some really nice features in the cameras for manual focus. So really things that will help out tremendously for macro photographers. The first one being focus peaking. And this can be enabled in the menu. So if you go into the first camera tab, on the newer menus, you'll actually have a header that says focus assist. And in there, you'll have focus peaking. Here you can toggle this feature on and off. So it'll jump in when we go into manual focus on the camera. You can adjust the focus peaking level from low to medium to high. I advise usually using mid or low, just because the band for that focus gets pretty wide when we're at high, and it's a little tougher to judge where focus is falling for me. So usually I'm using mid or low. And then for focus peaking color, you'll have a bunch of options here as well. Pick a color that's going to pop on my subject. So I don't want to choose red if I'm photographing a red rose. Instead, maybe choose white or yellow, something that will stand out from the subject. You also have the option for a focus magnifier. So by default, the camera is usually set up that if I start manually focusing, it'll automatically magnify what I see. Personally, I'm not a big fan of using this function in this way. So I like to be more in control of it. If you're the same way, when you go into your camera in that same focus assist menu, go into the manual focus assist and turn this off. And then it won't automatically magnify as soon as I start manually focusing. And then that option on the top that we're seeing on the menu called focus magnifier, I'll actually set this as a custom button. And then later I can actually deploy it as I want to use it. Which brings us right into customizing the buttons on the camera. On the camera, you have a ton of buttons that you can customize, almost all of them really. And so there's a ton of features we can add to this to really make it our own, honestly. And these are features on the custom buttons that I would set that I want to be able to get to right away. I don't want to have to open any menus. I just want to press one button and have that feature readily available. To set your custom buttons, you're going to go into that second camera tab on your main menu. And it's usually like the second to last page on most models. And you'll have an option that says custom key or custom key settings. When you click into here, depending on the generation of camera you've got, you'll either have an diagram of the camera showing the button and then what's currently set for that button. Otherwise, on some of the previous generation cameras, it'll actually show a list on the left that just describes the button, and then a list on the right that is showing what is currently set for that button. So some of the features that I actually like to turn on, I like to have autofocus area and autofocus mode set to my C1 and C2 button. I like to have the autofocus manual focus toggle set on the lens button or the focus hold button. And that's just so that if I'm shooting other things, I can actually just quickly one button press and I'll switch into manual focus. This is really nice if you're using the 50mm macro because I can just press that one button. If you have the 90mm macro, you can actually just toggle between autofocus and manual focus by pushing or pulling the focus ring forward and back. So it's not as needed if you're using the 90mm macro. I leave drive mode and ISO set as the left and the right on the thumb pad. They're just there by default, and I'm so used to them being there that it works out really well for me. I'm trained for them to be there. Down on the thumb pad, I usually set as white balance, so I can just quickly jump into that and adjust color balance. And then that center button I leave as focus magnifier. So as I'm doing close-up work and as I'm going to go into manual focus, I can use that focus magnifier to enlarge what I'm looking at, and I can really fine-tune where my focus is. On the camera, you also have a function menu, which is really just a short menu with the most popular items already pre-saved on it. This can be completely altered and customized to your liking as well. This is found right in the same spot as the custom key settings that we were just talking about. You'll have a function menu settings. And when you click into that, you'll be presented with one of two options. So the current generation, it'll actually show you the focus or the function menu as it is. And you just click on the tile you want to adjust. On the previous generation cameras, you'll have the two lists again. So the first one just talking about what tile we're looking at, and the one on the right telling you what's currently set for that tile. Some of the things that I like to set for my function menu, I like to have the steady shot to be able to turn it on and off. So if I'm on a tripod and I'm doing maybe a slightly longer exposure, I can turn off steady shot. The DRO settings, I like to have readily available. I will note that if you shoot RAW and you're using Adobe software, that these two don't really play well together, and a lot of times it'll load into Lightroom and all of a sudden be a stop darker, and it's just that the Lightroom software doesn't see this DRO function in the file. If you shoot JPEG, it's not an option at all, so there you go. Creative style, I like to leave on here too, just because it gives a fun kind of creative play style I can do with a lot of the images. Do note that this is only available if you use JPEG though. The peaking color, I like to save on that function menu as well. Again, I might be at a botanical garden photographing flowers, and one's red, the next one's blue. This way I can quickly switch that color. I don't have to jump deep into a menu to find it. I also suffer from a illness where when I photograph things, I tend to lean to one side if I'm hand holding. So being able to put grid lines on so I can make sure my horizon lines are straight and level is very nice as well. This is also a great thing because you can turn on rule of thirds, and it's a nice, easy guide to help you as you're practicing your rule of thirds. And then I like to have the wireless flash piece on there as well. Like I said, a lot of times I'll use the flash remote of the camera, and this is just nice to be able to toggle this on and off. The other nice thing with most of the Sony cameras have in-body stabilization in them as well, which will correct for pitch, yaw, and roll, as well as X and Y. If we're pairing that with a stabilized lens, the lens will provide the X and Y, and the sensor will do the pitch, yaw, and roll. This is one of those things, though, that I will turn it off if I'm doing a longer exposure on a tripod. Just a quick example with stabilization on versus stabilization off. All right, and so let's talk a little bit about technique. First one being if I'm using a tripod. So my autofocus settings, if I'm going to be on a tripod, I'll set the camera to AFC if I have a moving subject. Picture like a flower, but in a breeze kind of, so it's moving back and forth or swaying. If my subject's not moving, if I'm in a very controlled environment or there's just no wind, then I can go into a manual focus, but we'll come back to that. The focus area that I will set is going to be flexible spot with AFC. That way I can actually move this around to where I want my subject to be, or where my subject is rather. Again, if my subject isn't moving at all, like a coin on a table or just no wind at all and the subjects aren't moving, then I can go into manual focus. The key here is I want to make sure that focus peaking is turned on. I want to have a color that stands out from my subject as well. A lot of times with the tripod, I will set the drive mode to single shot, and then I'm either going to use a shutter release cable or I'm going to use the Imaging Edge app as my remote. A lot of times I have a 2-second timer set on as well. If I'm using a cabled remote, I don't need the timer. If I'm using the mobile device or if I'm just don't have anything, I can do a 2-second delay on it and just press the shutter button. That way I'm not adding shake to the shot. Steady shot I'll turn off. And then the way I'm going to recompose for my shot is I'm actually going to move the tripod in and out. So I'm actually going to pick up everything and I'm going to move it closer. And when I'm on a tripod, I'm typically photographing through the back screen on the camera, not the viewfinder. I find it's a lot easier on my back throughout the day. All right, if I'm doing macro handheld, this changes a little bit, but not a ton. So if I'm doing handheld, if I have a moving subject, again, if this is going to be like bugs, bees on a flower, things like that, I want to set the camera to AFC so that it's constantly focusing with my subject. And then I'm going to set my focus to lock on or tracking autofocus area. And I'm going to put flexible spot small. This just gives me a really pinpoint accurate focus, and I can put that focus point on my subject. As I hold down, the focus points will track with the subject so I can recompose the shot after I've engaged focus with them. If my subject isn't really moving, think, like, again, flowers, but there's no wind, things like that. Or if I'm photographing details and stuff like that, I can get away with using manual focus and being handheld. I just want to make sure, again, focus peaking is on, and then it's a color that stands out from my subject. My drive mode, I will set to burst. This way, as I hold down the shutter button, I'm capturing multiple images. Steady shot will be on because I'm actually going to have some shake, so this can help correct any shake I'm adding into the image. And then as we shoot, I'm going to be actually looking through the viewfinder when I'm shooting handheld, but we have a tendency to kind of sway forward and backward as we shoot. So as I'm shooting and I have that burst mode, even if I'm in manual focus, as I'm swaying, I can watch that focus peaking, moving back and forth on my subject. And as I hold down the shutter and shoot, that burst of photos will capture multiple. I can then go through and review and make sure I pick the one where focus fell where I was aiming to get. If I'm doing the lock on or the tracking focus, same option. As I'm holding halfway down, it's going to follow my subject. So even if I sway, the focusing is going to readjust. That's everything I have for you guys today. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.